What's up, Epic Army? This is Radical Edward with Less Than Epic, and today we're bringing you a deck tech of a standard mono-red aggro strat in the Guilds of Ravnica block. There are a ton of different versions of this deck floating around right now, but really, they all use the same cards, just in different numbers. The strategy of the deck is pretty straightforward aggro. You want to be playing spells fast enough to overwhelm the opponent before they can set up their strategy, dismantling their permanents with burn while also swinging and burning them to death. Let's take a look at my version of mono-red aggro before seeing the deck in action. So let's kick it off with our 1-cost cards. We've got 3 Fanatical Firebrands, 4 Gitsu Lava Runners, and 4 Shock. Really, you can't go wrong with either of these as your first turn play. Your Gitsu is going to get beefed up after turn 2 and 3, and your Fanatical Firebrand is going to do damage early and have that burn onto something like a Llanowar Elves if you need it. So really, you can't go wrong with any of these as your first turn, and I wouldn't even be worried if you just have like 2 Shocks and a Lightning Strike. It's okay to just start out with burn, though it is good to have your permanents on the field early. Okay, let's take a look at the 2-cost cards. We've got Lightning Strike, followed by Runaway Steamkin and Vashino Pyromancer. Vashino and Lightning Strike are pretty much just straight burn, but the benefit of Vashino is he also gives you a 2-1 permanent on the field. But really, we want to look at Runaway Steamkin, because this is who the deck is built around, basically. You are casting low-cost red spells, which you have plenty of in this deck, and then he is getting beefed up in the process, and then once he's beefed up to a 4/4, then you can use those counters to add more mana to your mana pool and cast into your later game. If you don't get enough mana early game, you can still win with even 2 or 3 mana on the field just by using Runaway Steamkin's ability. Anyway, let's move on to our 3-cost. In the 3-mana cost slot, we have Goblin Chain Whirler followed by Wizard's Lightning. Now, Wizard's Lightning is a interesting one because you have plenty of wizards in this deck with the Gitsu and the Vashino Pyromancer. They're both wizards, so Wizard's Lightning very often is just going to cost you 1 mana, the same mana cost as your Shock. So it's almost like a 1 mana cost Lightning Strike. But even if you don't get those guys, you can still pay the 3 and cast this. You will win tons of games just by having... one game I had, I think, 3 of this guy in my hand and a Vashino, and I just pounded in their face for 3 mana, 9 damage. It's a very, very strong card. And then your Goblin Chain Whirler is awesome for clearing any early game 1/1s that your enemy has. It's especially good against token decks, and not for nothing, it's a 3/3 first strike, so very strong card here. Okay, now let's take a look at the 4-cost. We've got Experimental Frenzy, followed by Rekindling Phoenix. Experimental Frenzy is another card that this deck is built around, and in combo with Runaway Steamkin, it's actually a pretty devastating card, because you can just be playing the top card of your deck and then beefing up Runaway Steamkin and then spending that mana to spend more cards from the top of your deck. Yeah, it gets pretty gross. And then Rekindling Phoenix is kind of like a secondary win strat, I would say, to the Runaway Steamkin and burn and aggro strat of the rest of the deck. It is just an extremely powerful red card, and pretty much any red deck that is winning tournaments right now is running this card, just because it's so freaking strong. You can't get rid of it most of the time, and even if you do, we're running 3, so usually you can get 1 to 2 of these guys out. And finally, for the mana, we're running 22 Mountains in this deck. Very low mana, I would say, but with the rest of the deck being as cheap as it is, plus with you having spells like this, which cost less depending on what you have on the field at the time, along with Runaway Steamkin, which gives you mana build, it's actually not that bad. And oftentimes, I find that I have too much mana rather than not enough. Oddly enough, with the 22 Mountains in this deck, you would think it's not enough, but it actually is plenty. So that's one version of this deck. Personally, I've seen a roughly 70% win rate in casual on MTG Arena, and I think that this strat is mega powerful right now. It does have some weaknesses, however. It's fairly weak against any mid-range deck that can set up. though if you get enough burn to dismantle a mid-range's field early enough, you can definitely win. I've also had some issues against Jeskai control decks specifically, but that could just be because of that strat's prevalence in Standard right now. This deck also has some issues against green aggro, but less so than the other strats since you can easily dismantle the mana build in those types of decks. As for what this deck is good against, pretty much any strategy that can't stop your first 3 turns. If mono red aggro makes it to turn 4 without being too severely dismantled or countered, it's probably going to win. And like I said in my testing, that happens roughly 70% of the time in casual play. And given that this deck can be built fairly cheaply if you're willing to build it without the Rekindling Phoenix, I would say it's a pretty easy way to get a very competitive deck on the cheap. Alright, that's the whole deck, so if you just came for the deck list and aren't interested in seeing how the deck is played, I'll leave that in the description for you, and thanks for watching. Give a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. If you're sticking around to see how the deck is played, please enjoy the following games and I'll pop in for some commentary where necessary. So this game is a really good example of how this deck wins even when it's facing a field of permanents that's way stronger than what it has. So this is a damn near perfect hand with this deck. 3 mana is obviously best with the curve in this deck, but you can definitely survive with 2. So the reason you play the Vaishino first in this scenario is you want to utilize all of your mana as early as possible in this deck. Any deck that can get early permanents out to stop you swinging at them is a problem for this mono red aggro strat, so you need to use your early game burn cards to get rid of their field first before you can use the burn cards against the enemy's life total. I'm playing it more cautious here because I can see what the opponent is leading up to, and I don't have a lot of permanents in my hands to replenish my field if I lose the Vaishino. And I don't know what I want to use the Lightning Strike on since he could lay something down that would be good for me to remove. So I don't really have many moves here other than waiting for my opponent to make a move that I can counter. And since the opponent didn't lay something down that I wanted to kill, I decided to use the Lightning Strike against his life total to start my aggro strat back up. Getting your opponent's life total to a critical state as early as possible is what you want to do with this deck because it's a minds game that will keep them playing on the back foot now. So that removal was pretty rough for this deck, but we're about to roll into Experimental Frenzy, and what you want is exactly what we get here. Drawing a mana, playing the Experimental Frenzy, and having no more cards in your hand. We couldn't have a more perfect setup to burn the enemy to death. And we actually want to be drawing into mana like this as well, because next turn we're going to draw that, not be able to play it from our hand, and then play cards from the top of our deck. This is perfect setup. But now we're going to see how the opponent is playing their deck strat very well as well. That is a very strong permanent field for our mono red strat to deal with, but we are actually set up perfectly to burn them to death through it. So let's see how we do that. So the goal is to get enough permanents on the field to block their 7/6 while we're burning them in the face like we just did for 5. So this next play is exactly what you want to look for in this scenario. We actually get really lucky and get precisely the burn that we need. So even when you're up against a stronger permanent field than what you have, you can still win with this deck because of the burn. But now let's jump over to another very short game. The guy kind of gave up at the end, but it showcases what you can do with the Steamkin really well. Sorry, this guy kind of takes a long time with his turns. Maybe he's just testing a new deck of his, so we can't really fault him for that. So the token strat is not a bad strat against an aggro deck like this, but he kind of falls into a trap in this turn. Let's watch how that plays out. So because of how the stack works, I'm actually opting to hold my Wizard's Lightning until after I attack, since even if he blocks with both of his tokens, I'm going to be able to use the Wizard's Lightning, save my Steamkin, and do 3 damage to his face. So overall it would be a very good trade if he fell into that trap. Yeah, again, sorry, he really took some time to make his moves. And that is the kind of funny stuff you can do with the Steamkin. At this point, my field is almost too stacked early game for my opponent to do much of anything to it, especially since I have more burn coming, as well as that experimental frenzy, which I can use the Steamkin to pay for next turn after I burn and attack. So overall, just a very stacked field, and it's going to be really hard for the opponent to overcome that. Unlucky for him, he probably got a high cost hand from the start, and now this turn I can just Lightning Strike into the Shock and then right into the Experimental Frenzy because I have 4 mana. This is pretty much the perfect hand to roll with this mono red aggro deck, and of course the opponent sees that and just kind of gives up at this point. You'll actually get a lot of people giving up pretty early when they see how this strat is working out. Don't worry about that, it happens. Alright, so I'll leave it there for the example games. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think about this deck? Did you build a version of this deck, and what were your experiences with it? Let's have a chat about it in the comments below. Also, if you like this video, then like this video and subscribe to the channel for future deck techs. Thanks for watching everyone, and this is Radical Edward for Less Than Epic, signing out.